The lock changed at 12:01 in the morning, not at midnight, not even at the stroke of the hour when some small mercy might have softened the precision of the act. At 12:01, one deliberate minute past the legal threshold of Wren Calloway's 18th birthday, Gretchen Calloway stood in the doorway of the house on Birchwood Lane in Roanoke, Virginia, and turned the deadbolt with the practiced calm of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for years. She did not say goodbye. She did not say anything at all. She simply looked at Wren through the narrow gap in the door, pale eyes catching the yellow porch light expression, as composed as polished stone, and then the door swung shut with a sound that was almost gentle. A soft hydraulic click. The kind of sound a bank vault makes when the mechanism is working exactly as intended. Wren stood on the front porch in the November cold and stared at the door for a long time. She was wearing a thin canvas jacket over a flannel shirt. On the weathered wooden planks at her feet sat two black garbage bags and a battered canvas duffel, the zipper of which had broken some time in the last year and been replaced with a bungee cord. Everything she owned in the world was in those three containers. 18 years of a life. Two changes of clothes, a dog-eared copy of a field guide to Appalachian flora that her father had given her when she was 9. A framed photograph she had taken from the hallway that morning while Gretchen was on the phone, the only photograph in the house that showed Silas Calloway, smiling, standing waist-deep in a river somewhere in the Shenandoah Valley with a water testing kit in his hands and the sun directly behind him, turning everything gold. The November air in Roanoke carried the particular bite of the southern Appalachian Mountains at elevation. Not the brutish, flat cold of the Midwest, but something older and sharper. It moved through fabric like it knew the terrain intimately, like it had been cutting through these ridges for 10,000 years, and had no patience for anyone who came without proper gear. Wren picked up her bags. She walked down the porch steps to the driveway where the truck was parked. It was a 2009 Ford F25O, dark blue once, but now the color of old pewter. The passenger door wearing a long scar from some encounter with a fence post or a guardrail that Silas had never gotten around to explaining. The bed was lined with a rubber mat caked in dried red clay from a dozen geological surveys. The interior smelled like his coffee thermos and his rain jacket, and the particular combination of topographical maps and solitude that had defined the last decade of his working life. Wren had sat in this truck hundreds of times on roads exactly like the ones she was about to drive. She knew every rattle and shudder of it. She knew which gear caught on cold mornings and which window you had to hold slightly closed or it would vibrate at highway speeds. Her father had left it to her. The truck, $500, and a piece of paper describing 5 acres of vertical cliff face in the Shenandoah Valley that no one had ever been able to explain. She loaded her bags into the bed, securing them under a tarp. She climbed into the driver's seat. She did not look back at the house. She turned the ignition, and the old Ford shuddered to life in the dark. Wren Calloway drove out of the neighborhood where she had grown up, turned onto the highway, and let the mountains swallow her. She pulled into a Cracker Barrel parking lot 40 minutes outside of town at nearly 1 in the morning. She was not tired. She was too cold and too hollow to be tired. She sat in the truck with the engine off, watching a sodium vapor light flicker over the nearly empty lot, and she allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of something that was not quite crying. More, a sustained internal pressure, like a fault line adjusting, and then she opened the glove compartment. The documents from Prescott Hale's office were folded in a manila envelope. She spread them across the passenger seat. The deed to parcel 12F in Shenandoah County. The title to the truck. A bank cashier's check for $500 made out in her name. And the will itself, 4 pages of dense legal language that had taken everything Silas Calloway had built over 30 years and placed it with the dispassionate efficiency of a notarized signature into the hands of his wife. Wren had been present at the reading. She had sat in a leather chair in Prescott Hale's office in downtown Roanoke. Hale was 55, silver-haired, the kind of man whose suits cost more than most people's monthly rent. And she had listened while he explained with a tone of practiced sympathy that barely concealed its own boredom that the estate of Dr. Silas Calloway, including the primary residence at 14 Birchwood Lane, the investment accounts, the retirement portfolios, and all personal property therein had been left to his surviving spouse, Gretchen Calloway. To his daughter, the will left the truck, the cash sum, and parcel 12F. Gretchen had not smiled at the reading. She was too careful for that. She had simply sat with her hands folded, and her expression set at a frequency of restrained grief that Wren suspected she had calibrated very precisely. Later in the hallway outside Hale's office, Gretchen had placed one hand on Wren's arm, warm, dry, perfectly steady, and said with the tone of someone delivering news about a minor administrative inconvenience, "You understand I have to think about my own security? Your father would have wanted me to be practical." Wren had not responded. She had looked at Gretchen's hand on her arm and thought about her father. Silas Calloway had died of a cardiac event 5 months prior, on a Tuesday morning in June, alone in his home office. The paramedics had arrived within 12 minutes. The county medical examiner, a man named Dr. Orville Pruitt, who had held that office for 19 years and was known primarily for his efficiency and his brevity, had ruled the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction. Silas was 58 years old. He had no diagnosed heart condition. He had been described by his physician as being in excellent cardiovascular health at his last checkup 14 months before his death. No one had asked any questions that mattered. Wren was 17 when her father died. She had been staying with a school friend in Charlottesville for the week. She got the call on a Wednesday morning and drove back on roads she barely remembered navigating. She had spent the following months inside a grief so complete it had a physical texture, like moving through something dense and resistant that resisted every step. Gretchen had been present and organized and efficient in all the ways that grief management required, and Wren had been too hollowed out to read what was underneath the efficiency. Now, sitting in a parking lot at 1 in the morning, with everything she owned in the truck bed, she was beginning to read it. She folded the documents back into the envelope. She reached into the back seat to retrieve her duffel. She needed the field guide for no particular reason, except that she wanted to hold something her father had touched. She unzipped the bungee cord and pushed aside the folded clothes. Her fingers found something rigid at the bottom of the bag. Not the book. She pulled it out, a small white envelope sealed with her name, written on the front in her father's handwriting. The ink was slightly smeared, the way his handwriting always smeared when he wrote quickly. He had always written quickly when he was worried about something. Wren sat very still for a moment. She looked at her own name on the envelope in the dim light. Then she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting was dense and slightly compressed, like he had been writing in a hurry and had too much to say for the space available. The letter was dated August 14th. 8 months ago. 3 months before he died. Wren, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the reading of the will has already happened. I know what you received. I know what it looks like. I need you to understand that it is not what it looks like. Parcel 12, F is not a piece of land. It is not a cliff face. It is not worthless. Do not let anyone convince you it is worthless. I have spent the last 3 years building something there that no one knows about. I built it for you. I built it because there came a point when I understood what was happening, and I needed to make sure that when the time came, you would have what you needed to survive it. Drive to the property, take the old Forest Service Road off Route 675, 3 miles north of Woodstock. Park at the fire gate. Walk the dry stream bed uphill. You will find a sycamore tree that was struck by lightning and split down the middle. Behind it, behind the pawpaw thicket, there is an opening in the rock. The Medico key on your ring opens what you will find there. Do not go in the first time without being absolutely certain you are alone. Do not trust Prescott Hale. Do not call the local sheriff. His name is Dodd, and he has been on Apex Continental's payroll for 3 years. Trust your own judgment. Trust what you find. I am sorry I could not be there to explain this in person. You are the best thing I ever did, Wren. Everything in that mountain belongs to you. She read it twice, then she read it a third time slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less enormous. Apex Continental. She knew the name. Her father had mentioned it in passing several times over the past few years. A large energy and infrastructure company with significant operations across Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. He had done consulting work for a nonprofit environmental organization that was monitoring water quality in several rural counties. He had mentioned Apex in the context of that work, usually with the tight-jawed restraint he used when he was genuinely angry about something, and had decided not to burden her with it. She had not asked enough questions. She understood that now with a clarity that was its own kind of pain. Wren sat in the Cracker Barrel parking lot until nearly 3 in the morning, the letter in her lap and the heater running low. Then she made a decision that was not really a decision so much as the only available direction. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inner pocket of her jacket against her chest. She drove north. The Forest Service Road off Route 675 was exactly where the letter described a narrow, unpaved track, partially obscured by decades of overgrowth, easy to miss if you did not know it was there. Wren parked the F-250 at the fire gate just as the first gray light was beginning to come up over the eastern ridge. She sat for a few minutes watching the tree line. No other vehicles. No sound except wind and the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere in the pines. She loaded a backpack flashlight, the Medico key from her key ring, a water bottle, leather work gloves, and the letter. She locked the truck and started walking. The dry stream bed cut uphill through the mountain with the kind of purposeful geometry that water leaves behind when it finds a permanent channel and then abandons it. The stones were smooth and pale, arranged in overlapping layers like the pages of a book compressed over centuries. The surrounding forest was dense with Virginia pine and red oak, the undergrowth heavy with mountain laurel and the dried remnants of summer fern. The climb was steep enough to demand attention. Wren had grown up walking in these mountains. Her father had made sure of that. She found her footing without thinking about it, moving uphill at a steady pace, her breath forming small white clouds in the cold morning air. She found the sycamore 40 minutes into the climb. It was unmistakable, a large tree, probably 100 years old, that had been struck by lightning at some point in the past decade and split cleanly from crown to root, the two halves leaning away from each other like the pages of an open book. The wood of the split was weathered silver, and the base of the tree had become a tangle of old growth and creeping vine. Behind the sycamore, dense and aggressive, entangled into a barrier that would discourage anyone without a specific reason to push through, it was a thicket of pawpaw, a native understory tree that grew in colonies. its stems close packed and interwoven, the kind of natural obstruction that looked entirely unremarkable in this landscape. Wren used a heavy branch to press the growth aside, pushing through a gap that required her to turn sideways and stepped into a narrow shadow. It was not just shadow, it was a fissure, a vertical crack in the granite face of the cliff, perhaps 18 inches across at its widest point, running up the rock face for 30 feet. The kind of fracture that earthquakes leave in solid stone when the mountain settles, and, that time, then conceals under moss and mineral deposits until it resembles nothing more than a deep shadow on the rock. Wren clicked on her flashlight and turned sideways into the fissure. The air dropped 10 degrees immediately. The smell was ancient wet granite and compressed mineral dust, and something underneath it that she could not immediately identify, something dry and metallic and purposeful. She shuffled forward 15 feet, the rock pressing against her chest, and back, the flashlight beam cutting a narrow path into the darkness ahead. And then the fissure widened. She was standing in a natural cavern, roughly oval, the ceiling rising to perhaps 12 feet at its highest point. The floor was smooth stone. A head set into the back wall of the cavern with an engineering precision that was absolutely at odds with the natural surroundings was a steel door. It was not decorative. It was not ornamental. It was a door built entirely around the proposition of permanence, 4 inches of solid steel, framed in heavy concrete, anchored deep into the granite, the surface dark with controlled oxidation, the frame sealed with weatherproof compound. In the center of the door was a heavy circular locking mechanism with a single small keyhole. Wren stood in front of it for a long moment. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence of the cavern. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the Medico key. The cylinder accepted the key with the particular resistance of a mechanism that had been engineered to tight tolerances and maintained against the intrusion of moisture and time. Wren applied pressure. There was a grinding resistance metal against itself, and then, with a sound like a gunshot in the confined space, the cylinder turned. The door opened outward. Wren braced herself against the weight of it, the rusted hinges protesting with a shriek that echoed through the cavern and down the fissure. A rush of dry, controlled air moved past her, not stale, not dead, but climate managed, temperature regulated, the air of a sealed space that had been designed to preserve. She stepped inside. The space beyond the door was the size of a 2-car garage, perhaps slightly larger. The walls were poured concrete, reinforced with steel channel, the ceiling crossed with heavy beams. A diesel generator sat in the near corner, its fuel tank partially depleted, but not empty. Along the right wall ran a set of metal shelving units holding sealed containers of food, freeze-dried provisions, the kind used for long-term emergency storage, a folding cot with a military-grade sleeping bag, a water filtration unit connected to what appeared to be a collection tank, fed by a narrow bore that disappeared into the ceiling. Her father had not just dug a hole in the mountain. He had built a habitation, a place where a person could survive for months in relative comfort, completely undetected by the outside world. In the center of the room stood a steel table, and on the table sat a filing cabinet, a portable hard drive connected to a small laptop, and a sealed waterproof case. Wren set down her pack, took off her gloves, and opened the filing cabinet. The files were organized with the methodical precision that had defined everything her father did. Color-coded dividers, labeled tabs, 6 years of documentation arranged in chronological sequence with cross-referenced indices. She pulled the first file and began to read. The picture assembled itself slowly, the way a photograph develops in a dark room. First the outlines, then the details, then the full depth of what was there. Apex Continental had been conducting hydraulic fracturing operations in multiple locations across the Appalachian Basin for the better part of a decade. This was publicly known, disclosed to regulators, and not in itself unusual. What was not publicly known was the disposal methodology for the chemical effluent generated by those operations. Fracking produced large volumes of highly toxic wastewater, a mixture of the hydraulic fracturing fluid itself and the naturally occurring minerals, salts, and radioactive materials that came back up from deep underground. The legally required disposal method was injection into specially permitted deep wells designed to isolate the waste far below any water bearing geological formation. Apex Continental had not been using the permitted disposal sites, not exclusively, and in some locations, not at all. The files documented what Silas Calloway had pieced together over 6 years of field work, water testing, geological analysis, and careful patient investigation. Apex had been disposing of significant quantities of fracking wastewater through illegal, shallow injection wells, drilled without permits at depths that allowed the contamination to migrate into the regional aquifer system. The aquifer that supplied drinking water to 4 counties in Virginia and 2 in West Virginia. The aquifer that fed the wells of thousands of homes, small farms, and rural communities that had no other source of fresh water and no resources to test what they were drinking. The contamination had been ongoing for at least 6 years. 847 confirmed cases of illness in the affected counties, elevated rates of kidney disease, neurological damage, rare cancers in populations that had no other identifiable risk factors, 23 deaths. The state health department had investigated twice and produced reports that attributed the illness clusters to statistical variance and recommended further study. Both reports had been authored by consultants with undisclosed financial relationships to Apex Continental. The county medical examiner for one of the most heavily affected counties, Shenandoah County, where Parcel 12F was located, was Dr. Orville Pruitt. Wren stopped reading. She stood at the steel table in her father's hidden room and looked at that name for a long time. Dr. Orville Pruitt, the man who had ruled her father's death as cardiac arrest. The man whose report had closed the case in 12 minutes. She opened the second file. This one was different from the first. Less formal, more personal. The handwriting on the tabs was less neat, written faster, with the slight degradation in penmanship that indicated stress. The first document in the file was a printed email chain, and the date on the earliest message stopped Wren cold. The email chain began 8 years ago. 2 years before Gretchen had met Silas Calloway at a conservation fundraiser in Harrisonburg and initiated what had appeared to be an organic romantic relationship. The earliest email was internal to Apex Continental, a communication between the head of the company's regulatory affairs division and someone identified only by the initials GW. The subject line read Callaway DOE, contact potential liability. The email read, in part, subject has significant institutional knowledge of aquifer systems in target operating area. Current position as independent consultant creates documentation risk. Suggest controlled approach per previous protocol. GW confirmed available and suitable for assignment. Compensation structure as discussed. Wren read it twice. Then she opened the next message in the chain. And the next. GW. She looked at the initials for a moment. Gretchen Wall. Gretchen's last name before she married Silas Calloway. Before she became Gretchen Calloway. She had not met Silas at a fundraiser by chance. She had been sent. The file contained 18 months of email correspondence documenting the operation. Gretchen's regular reports to her apex contact on Silas's movements, his research findings, his state of mind, his relationships, the things he was investigating, the people he was talking to. And then, as his investigation grew more serious and his documentation became more comprehensive, a shift in tone, the emails becoming more urgent, the instructions from Apex becoming more explicit. The last email in the chain was dated 4 months before Silas's death. It read, "Situation has become untenable. Callaway has full chain of custody documentation. Physical copies and digital backup. Location of backup unknown. Recommend transition to final protocol. Compensation upon confirmation. Final protocol." Wren sat down on the concrete floor. She did not plan to sit down. Her legs simply made the decision for her. She sat with her back against the steel shelving and the file in her lap in the silence of the mountain around her, and she tried to assemble what she was holding into something she could carry. Her father had known. He had known what was coming, and he had built this room, and he had gathered every piece of evidence he could find, and he had hidden it here, and he had left her a key, and he had written her a letter, and he had died before he could tell her any of it in person. Or he had appeared to die. That thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, and sat down beside everything else. She picked up the last file in the cabinet. It was thin 3 documents only. The first was a handwritten page in Silas's writing, dense with medical terminology. He had been documenting his own symptoms, fatigue, cardiac irregularities, intermittent confusion, elevated inflammatory markers. He had been running his own blood tests using equipment purchased privately without going through any physician he had reason to distrust. The results showed the presence of a specific organic compound, a synthetic industrial chemical used in Apex's fracking formulation at concentrations consistent with chronic low-dose exposure through contaminated water. He had been drinking from the tap in his own house, the house on Birchwood Lane with its municipal water connection. A connection that in that part of Roanoke drew from the same regional aquifer that Apex had been systematically poisoning. He had been poisoned. Not deliberately targeted, or at least not initially. He had been living downstream of the very crime he was investigating and slowly accumulating the evidence of it in his own bloodstream. But then, someone had decided to accelerate the process. The second document was a toxicology analysis, again self-administered, run through a private laboratory in Pennsylvania under a name she did not recognize. The results showed the presence of a second compound, this one not an industrial byproduct. A pharmaceutical derivative synthesized not naturally occurring, present at a concentration that suggested deliberate repeated administration over approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Someone had been adding something to his food or his water inside his own home. The third document was a single page torn from a legal pad. The handwriting was different from his usual style, slower, more deliberate, as though each word was being chosen with particular care. It read, "If I am wrong about what I suspect, then none of this matters, and you will find nothing here that changes anything. But if I am right, then what is in this room is the only leverage that exists against people who have spent considerable resources making sure that no leverage exists. Do not try to handle this alone. There's a name on the inside cover of the field guide in your bag. A man in Charlotte named Harlan Beckett. He is a former federal prosecutor who investigated Apex Continental 4 years ago and was removed from his position before he could bring charges. He knows this case from the other side of the wall. He has been waiting for someone to open the door. give him what is in this room. Trust him. He knew me. He will help you. Wren reached into her bag and pulled out the field guide to Appalachian flora that her father had given her when she was 9 years old. She opened the cover. On the inside, in pencil, faint easily overlooked, the kind of notation that looked like a page number or a library code. Unless you were looking for, it was a name and a phone number. Harlan Beckett, Charlotte, North Carolina. She sat on the floor of her father's hidden room in the side of a Virginia mountain and held the book in both hands. Outside, the November morning had fully arrived. Through the fissure, she could see a slant of cold gray light on the rock of the cavern floor. The mountain was silent in the particular way that mountains are silent in winter, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something much older than sound. She had come here 18 hours ago with $500, a broken zipper duffel, and no clear idea of what came next. She was still sitting on a concrete floor with no shower and no breakfast and a truck that needed new rear tires. But the shape of things had changed entirely. She was holding 6 years of documented evidence of one of the largest environmental crimes in the history of the Appalachian Basin. She had the chain of emails that proved her father's wife had been a corporate operative from the beginning. She had toxicology reports that suggested her father had been poisoned, first inadvertently, then deliberately inside his own home. And she had a name. She stood up, she put the field guide and the letter back in her bag. She began methodically and carefully to photograph every document in the filing cabinet with her phone backup copies in case anything happened to the originals. She photographed the email chain last, holding the phone steady with both hands, making sure every line was legible. When she was done, she closed the filing cabinet. She looked around the room one final time. The cot, the provisions, the generator, the careful and exhausting and heartbreaking evidence of a man who had known he was running out of time and had done everything in his power to make sure his daughter would not be left without weapons. She picked up her pack. The motion sensor on the camera, she had not yet noticed a small cellular unit mounted high in the corner of the cavern, partially obscured by a bolt head, registered her movement and logged it silently to a server she did not know existed. The timestamp on the log read 9:47 a.m. November 14th. She moved toward the door. The notification reached a phone in a location she could not have identified in that moment. The screen lit up the alert reading Parcel 12F entry detected. A man looked at the screen for a long moment. He set the phone face down on the surface beside him. He picked up a different phone, prepaid unregistered, and made a call. The call was answered on the second ring. He said, "She found it." Outside the cavern in the cold, clear air of the Shenandoah Valley morning, Wren Calloway was already moving back down the mountain with a backpack full of evidence that people had killed to suppress a name in Charlotte she had never heard before, and the first fragile stirring of something that was not grief and not fear. It was the thing that comes when you understand for the first time the true dimensions of what you are fighting. She did not know yet that her father was alive. She did not know about the second tunnel. She did not know that the man who had sent her the key and the letter and the name in the field guide had been watching her on a camera feed. From 40 feet away, his hand pressed flat against the cold concrete of a wall she had stood on the other side of without knowing it. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was this: she had a truck, a phone $600, and enough documented evidence to bring a corporation to its knees. She walked out of the mountain and into the cold Virginia morning and pointed herself toward Charlotte. The drive to Charlotte took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Wren drove it in silence, no radio, no podcasts, nothing but the sound of the F250's engine and the particular rhythm of mountain roads unwinding into Piedmont flatness as Virginia gave way to North Carolina. The sun stayed low and pale all morning, filtered through a high overcast that turned the sky the color of old pewter. She stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee. She barely tasted standing at the pump in the cold, with her jacket zipped to her chin. Watching the highway traffic move past with the indifferent momentum of a world that had no idea what she was carrying in her backpack. She thought about her father the entire drive, not the grief she'd been living inside that for 5 months and knew its contours by now. Something different, a reconstruction. She was putting together a version of the last 3 years of his life that she had not been allowed to see while she was living inside it, assembling it from documents and timestamps and the particular quality of restraint she now recognized in every memory of him from that period. The way he had sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence and looked at her with an expression she had read as tiredness and now understood was something else entirely. The weekend trips he took alone into the field that he described as routine monitoring. The night she had found him at his desk at 2 in the morning, the screen of his laptop angled away from her. He had been building a case while living in the same house as the person reporting his progress to the people he was building the case against. For 3 years. Alone. Wren gripped the steering wheel and stared at the road and did not permit herself to think about what that must have been like. Charlotte announced itself the way mid-sized American cities do from the south. A gradual thickening of commercial development along the highway corridor, fast food and storage facilities, and car dealerships giving way to office parks. And then, as she crossed into the city proper, the glass towers of the financial district catching the gray afternoon light. She followed the GPS south toward the South Park district, turned off the main commercial corridor, and found herself on a quieter street of older two-story buildings, the kind of real estate that small professional practices occupied when they needed a Charlotte address but could not justify downtown rent. The building she was looking for was above a sandwich shop. The entrance was a door beside the restaurant's exterior, unmarked, except for a small brass panel with a list of suite numbers. Suite 4, B. H. Beckett, Attorney at Law. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, thinking about what her father had written. He knew me. He will help you. She got out of the truck and went inside. The stairwell smelled like coffee and old carpet. The door to 4B was frosted glass, with the suite number stenciled on it in plain block letters. She knocked. A pause, then a voice low and slightly graveled said, "It's open." The office was not what she had imagined, though she was not sure what she had imagined. It was a single room, larger than it appeared, from outside, with 2 tall windows overlooking the street below, and walls lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving units holding binders, bankers' boxes, and stacks of legal documents held together with binder clips and rubber bands. A battered metal desk occupied the center of the space, its surface covered in organized strata of paper. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like someone had taken a federal prosecutor, removed all the institutional support, and left him alone with his work for 4 years to see what remained. Harlan Beckett was 62 years old and looked it without apology. He was broad across the shoulders and slightly too large for the desk chair he occupied, with gray hair that had been cut at some point in the past several weeks, but not recently, and a face that was all planes and angles, the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something more useful. His tie was loosened. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair. On the desk in front of him was a thick deposition transcript with yellow highlighting running through every third line. He looked up at Wren, and his eyes sharp dark, taking in everything, without appearing to move from her face to the backpack on her shoulder to her face again. "I don't have an appointment," Wren said. I can see that. He set down his highlighter. You look like you've been driving since before dawn. Sit down. She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk. She unzipped the backpack and pulled out the files. She had put the originals in a waterproof folder, organized in the same sequence her father had maintained. She set them on the desk in front of Harlan Beckett. My name is Wren Calloway, she said. My father was Silas Calloway. He told me to find you. Harlan Beckett did not move for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, more like the recognition of a thing you have been anticipating for so long that when it finally arrives, it carries the weight of every day you spent waiting for it. Silas Calloway, he said quietly. He died 5 months ago. Or... She stopped. He was declared dead 5 months ago. I am no longer certain those are the same thing. Beckett looked at her steadily. What's in the folder? 6 years of documentation on Apex Continental's illegal disposal operations in the Shenandoah and Potomac aquifer systems. Chain of custody evidence. A complete email record proving that his wife was a corporate operative placed to monitor and control him. Toxicology reports showing he was being poisoned. And a document trail connecting the county medical examiner who ruled his death as cardiac arrest to Apex Continental's payroll. She said it the way her father would have said it. Factually, without decoration. Letting the information carry its own weight. Beckett reached across the desk and opened the folder. He looked at the first document for perhaps 30 seconds, then the second, then turned to the email chain and read in silence for 3 full minutes. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the faint sounds of the sandwich shop, below a refrigerator hum, a door opening and closing. When he looked up, the expression on his face was not triumph. It was more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man who had been right about something terrible for a very long time, and felt no pleasure whatsoever in being confirmed. They pulled my appointment 4 years ago, he said. I was 6 weeks from convening a grand jury. The U.S. Attorney's Office received a formal complaint about my conduct from the senior senator from West Virginia. A complaint that was entirely fabricated, but thoroughly documented. And by the time I had assembled the rebuttal, the political momentum was gone, and my replacement had been sworn in. He paused. I kept copies of everything I had. I've been building the civilian case on my own time ever since. But without Silas's field documentation, I had correlation. I had pattern. I did not have proof. He looked at the folder on his desk. This is proof. What do we do with it? Wren asked. Carefully, Beckett said. We do everything very carefully, and we move faster than they expect us to. He leaned back in his chair. Tell me about the property. Parcel 12F. Tell me exactly what the physical situation is. She told him everything. The drive up the stream bed, the fissure, the steel door, the room her father had built, the generator, the supplies, the filing cabinet. She told him about the camera she had noticed on her way out, and the realization somewhere on the drive to Charlotte that if there was a camera, there was someone watching it. Beckett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How long ago did you leave the property? I left around 10 this morning. She checked the clock on her phone, nearly 3. 5 hours. He stood up and moved to the window, looking down at the street below. Apex has a rapid response legal team specifically for situations where their exposure documentation might surface. If they know you access the property, they will have already begun the process. He turned from the window. We have a narrow window, Wren. Probably less than 72 hours before they find a legal mechanism to restrict your access to that property and its contents. What kind of mechanism? The kind that a corporation with $200 million in annual legal budget can manufacture with moderate creativity and a cooperative judge. He moved back to his desk and sat down. There is a federal judge in the Western District of Virginia named Patricia Ellsworth who has been resistant to Apex's influence. I know this because I've watched her rulings for 4 years. If I can get an emergency petition in front of her before Apex files their motion, we have a chance to establish your legal standing and protect the contents of that property before they can be designated as corporate assets. Can you do that in 72 hours? I've been waiting 4 years to do it, Beckett said. I can do it in 48. She looked at him across the desk. This man her father had trusted enough to leave as the only name in the only book he had given her. She thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, its instructions precise, and its trust complete. All right, she said. Tell me what you need from me. What Beckett needed from her, it turned out, was considerable. They spent the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening at the desk in his office, working through the documentation systematically. Beckett reading, annotating, cross-referencing against his own 4-year archive of Apex-related material. He had a printer running continuously. The smell of hot paper and toner filled the small office. He ordered delivery food at 7 that nobody ate until 9, the containers sitting open on the corner of the desk while they worked. Wren answered questions. She had grown up watching her father work, the methodical, unhurried patience of a scientist moving through evidence, testing each connection before trusting it to bear weight. She found sitting across from Beckett in the lamp-lit office while November pressed against the windows that she knew how to do this. That her father had taught her, without her realizing it, how to think inside a problem rather than around it. At 10:30 that night, Beckett set down his pen and looked at her. Go get a room somewhere, he said. Not nearby. Pay cash. Do not use your regular phone to search for hotels, use incognito mode, or buy a prepaid at a gas station. Do not go back to Roanoke. Do not contact anyone in your personal life. And do not go back to Parcel 12F until I tell you it's clear. You think they're already watching me. I think that if they know you access that property today and the camera suggests they might then, yes, you are already a known variable in their risk calculus. He paused. Your father was careful for 3 years, and it still wasn't enough to keep them from finding ways to neutralize him. Don't give them an easy opportunity. She nodded. She repacked the originals into the waterproof folder. Beckett had digital copies of everything now backed up to 3 separate locations. The originals stayed with her. One more thing, Beckett said as she stood to leave. You said you weren't certain your father was actually dead. The toxicology report, she said. He was testing himself. He knew what was happening to his body. He was a scientist with access to pharmaceutical resources from his DOE years. If he understood the mechanism being used against him, he might have been able to find a countermeasure. Or a way to simulate the final outcome before it became the actual outcome. Beckett looked at her for a long moment. Your father was one of the most methodical men I have ever encountered, he said finally. If he was going to disappear, he would have built himself a place to disappear to. Neither of them said anything else about it. But the idea sat in the room between them like a third presence, solid and breathing. Wren found a budget motel off the I-85 corridor, 12 miles south of the city, paid cash for 2 nights, and lay on the bed in her clothes with the backpack beside her and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep for 3 hours. When sleep finally came, it was deep, and without dreams, the sleep of a body that has been operating on adrenaline for 20 hours and has finally run out. She was back at Beckett's office by 8 the next morning with 2 coffees from the gas station on the corner. He had not slept. The desk was covered in fresh annotations, and the printer had run out of paper at some point during the night. I filed the emergency petition at 6:15 this morning, he said, taking the coffee. Judge Ellsworth's clerk acknowledged receipt at 7:40. We will know within 24 hours whether she grants the preliminary hearing. He looked at Wren over the rim of the cup. There is something else. He turned his laptop to face her. On the screen was a legal filing, a motion submitted to the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Virginia, timestamped at 11:58 the previous night. Apex Continental filed this 13 hours after you left the property, Beckett said. They are claiming that Parcel 12F contains materials related to an ongoing environmental liability investigation by the company and requesting emergency court authority to access and secure the property and its contents pending litigation. Wren read the first page of the filing. They're claiming the documentation in the hatch belongs to them. They are claiming that the research conducted on company time using company resources, which they allege your father's independent consulting work, constituted under the terms of a non-disclosure agreement he signed when he left DOE, belongs to the corporate entity and not to his estate. Beckett's voice was level. It is a manufactured argument, and it will not survive serious scrutiny. But it does not need to survive serious scrutiny immediately. It only needs to survive long enough for a compliant judge to issue a temporary restraining order. Is there a compliant judge? There is always a compliant judge, Beckett said. The question is whether Apex finds theirs before we find ours. The answer came 8 hours later. Wren was sitting in Beckett's office working through the cross-reference index he had asked her to compile when his phone rang. He answered, listened for 40 seconds, said, "Thank you, Patricia," and hung up. He looked at Wren. Judge Ellsworth granted the preliminary hearing. Day after tomorrow, 9 a.m., Federal Courthouse in Harrisonburg. He paused. She also issued a temporary protective order on Parcel 12F and its contents, effective immediately preventing any third party from accessing the property pending the hearing. Wren felt something release in her chest, a pressure she had been holding since she stood in the cavern and first understood what the files contained. "That's good," she said. "It is good," Beckett agreed. "It is also a signal to Apex that the case has found a federal venue they do not control, and they will respond accordingly." He sat down heavily. This is the point in the engagement where things tend to become less procedural. He was right about that. It happened 18 hours before the hearing. Wren had gone back to Parcel 12F. She knew she shouldn't. Beckett had been explicit stay away from the property until the hearing. But the protective order covered the contents of the hatch, and what she needed was not inside the hatch. It was the original hard drive backup her father had mounted to the underside of the steel table, a drive she had not taken on her first visit, because she hadn't known to look for it and had only identified when she reviewed her photographs of the room in detail at the motel. The hearing was in 18 hours. The drive contained her father's raw field data. Not the summary documents in the filing cabinet, but the primary measurements. The GPS-logged sample sites, the unprocessed data that would allow an independent scientist to replicate his findings from scratch. Without the raw data, Apex's lawyers would argue that the summary documents in the filing cabinet were selective, curated, potentially fabricated. With the raw data, the case was airtight. She told herself she would be in and out in under 30 minutes. She took a circuitous route up from the highway, changed direction, twice watched her mirrors the entire way. The pull-off was clear. The tree line was still. She loaded the pack and started up the stream bed in the gray pre-dawn dark. She was at the cavern door in 40 minutes. The fisher was silent. She slipped through, clicked on her headlamp, and moved to the steel door. The key turned. The door opened. She was inside for perhaps 8 minutes. She found the hard drive where her photographs had shown it magnetically mounted to the underside of the steel table wrapped in anti static foam. She pulled it free, secured it in a padded pocket of her backpack, and stood up. That was when she heard it. Not a sound from outside, a sound from inside the room from the far end where the concrete wall met the floor. A small, deliberate sound. The specific sound of a boot sole shifting its weight on a hard surface. Wren's headlamp was the only light in the room. She swung it toward the sound. Taft was standing in the corner near the second ventilation access, a secondary bore she had not noticed on her first visit, too small for a standard adult to enter comfortably, but navigable for a man who was motivated and did not mind discomfort. He was heavy set in his mid 50s, wearing a dark tactical jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. In his right hand, held loosely at his side but not lowered, was a Glock 19. He looked at her without particular urgency. The look of a professional who has been in this situation enough times to have removed the adrenaline from it. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was flat and unhurried. "Set the pack down." Wren did not set the pack down. She stood very still with the headlamp pointed at him, calculating distances and angles with the part of her mind that had come alive in the past 72 hours and showed no sign of going quiet again. "I just need to know if you've made copies," Taft said. He took one step toward the center of the room. "That's all. You tell me that, and this gets simpler for everybody." "Copies of what?" Wren said. "Don't." His voice carried no heat, just the flat certainty of a man who was not going to be deflected by the obvious play. "The filing cabinet, the drive you just pulled, copies." He took another step. "Have you given anything to anyone?" Wren's headlamp was directly in his eyes. She took one small step to her left, casual, barely perceptible, and then another. Taft tracked her movement with his body turning slightly to keep her in his line of sight. As he turned his back, moved incrementally toward the far wall. And the door at the back of the room, the one that Wren had not discovered on her first visit, because she had not known to look for it, set into the wall behind the two tall equipment lockers her father had positioned as concealment, opened. It opened quietly. The hydraulic mechanism her father had installed made almost no sound. The man who stepped through it was thin-bearded, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had been living in a confined space for months and had learned to conserve everything, including motion. Taft heard it. He turned. He did not turn fast enough. Silas Calloway crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. What he did next was brief, controlled, and completely effective. Taft went down heavily, the Glock skittering across the concrete floor. Silas was breathing hard when he straightened up, one hand braced on the steel table, but his eyes, when they found Wren's face across the room, were absolutely clear. They looked at each other in the narrow beam of her headlamp. Wren's father was alive. He was thinner than she had ever seen him, and his beard had grown well past anything she had ever known him to wear, and the hollows under his eyes spoke of months lived in near darkness on rationed provisions. But it was him. Every particular of him, the jawline, the hands, the way he stood with his weight distributed slightly forward, like a man perpetually ready to walk toward the next thing that needed investigating. She crossed the room. She wrapped both arms around him without saying anything. She felt him close his arms around her in return, tentative at first, as though he could not quite believe she was solid, and then completely the way a person holds on when they have been afraid for a very long time. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The mountain was silent around them. Taft was unconscious on the concrete floor. The hard drive was in Wren's pack. Outside on the camera feed that Silas had been monitoring from the back tunnel for 5 months, the dry stream bed was empty and still in the early morning dark. When her father finally spoke, His voice was rougher than she remembered. 5 months of rationed water and recycled air had done that, but the steadiness underneath it was unchanged. I knew you'd find it, he said. I knew you'd come. You could have told me, Wren said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was something more complicated, the particular combination of relief and grief and anger that belongs specifically to people who love each other and have been kept apart by necessity. I couldn't protect you if you knew, he said. If you knew I was alive and they found that out, they would have used you to find me. The only way to keep you safe was for you to believe what they believed. He paused. I watched you on the camera, both times. I wanted to. He stopped. There were things I wanted to say to you through the wall. Wren stepped back and looked at him properly. She took inventory, his condition, his eyes, the quality of his alertness. He was depleted, but not broken. The man she had spent 5 months grieving was standing in front of her in a concrete room in the side of a Virginia mountain, and he was intact. We have a federal hearing in 16 hours, she said. Something shifted in her father's expression, the first version of something that was not quite a smile, but was moving in that direction. Tell me everything, he said. She did. Standing in the room he had built with Taft, zip-tied to a support beam, and the hard drive in her pack, and the morning pressing in around them, Wren told her father everything that had happened in the 72 hours since she had stood on a wet porch on Birchwood Lane and watched the lock change. She told it in sequence the way he had taught her facts. First, interpretations. Second, conclusions. Last. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a moment. Beckett filed the petition, he said. It was not quite a question. Beckett filed the petition. Judge Ellsworth granted the hearing. He nodded slowly. The expression on his face was complex, the expression of a man who has been carrying a plan alone for a very long time, and is now for the first time seeing it in the hands of someone else, and understanding that it is still intact. I built the escape tunnel to come out 2 miles north on the other side of the ridge, he said. There's a fire road access point that Apex doesn't know about. I've had a vehicle staged there for 4 months. He looked at Wren. I was waiting for the right moment to move. I was waiting for someone to open the door from the outside. He paused. I didn't expect it to be you doing it alone. You left me the key, Wren said. I did, he said. Then you knew it might be me. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she recognized from her entire childhood. The expression he wore when she had arrived at a conclusion that he was not yet ready to confirm, but could not honestly deny. Yes, he said. I knew it might be you. Outside the mountain, the Virginia morning was arriving without ceremony, pale light spreading across the ridgeline, the temperature dropping another 2 degrees toward the frost threshold. 16 miles away, on the interstate, a dark gray SUV with tinted windows and Virginia plates was parked at a rest stop, its engine running, its occupant speaking quietly into a phone. And in Charlotte, in the office above the sandwich shop, Harlan Beckett was at his desk before 6 a.m., working through the final structure of the petition that would be presented in a federal courthouse in 16 hours. Drinking cold coffee and not noticing because he had stopped noticing such things years ago, and moving with the focused, unhurried precision of a man who has been waiting 4 years for a door to open and is not going to waste a single minute now that it finally has. The escape tunnel took 40 minutes to navigate in the dark. Silas led, and Wren followed, moving single file through a passage that had been cut with hand tools over the course of 2 years of weekend work, disguised on the official survey records as a drainage bore and known to no one alive except the man who had dug it. The ceiling was low enough in places to require a sustained crouch. The walls were wet with seepage from the winter ground above. Silas moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this passage dozens of times in the dark, touching the walls at intervals with his fingertips like a man reading a familiar text. Wren followed the sound of his breathing and the faint phosphorescent strip he had taped to the back of his jacket for exactly this purpose. And she thought about the fact that her father had installed a phosphorescent strip on a jacket in an underground tunnel against the possibility that someday she would need to follow him through it. And she filed that thought away in the part of her mind that was managing the accumulated weight of the past 72 hours, which was getting crowded. They emerged through a wooden grate set into a steep embankment on the north face of the ridge. The grate was concealed under a growth of mountain laurel that Silas had planted himself 3 years ago, timed to the construction of the tunnel exit. He pushed it aside, and they climbed out into the gray pre-dawn cold of the Virginia mountains, and, for a moment, they both stood on the hillside breathing the open air. The fire road was a quarter-mile north through the trees, a narrow track overgrown enough to be invisible from the air and from any paved surface, accessible only if you knew the specific gap in the tree line where the old logging access had been cut. Parked at the end of it, covered in a camouflage tarp, weighted down with stones, was a 2017 Jeep Cherokee in dark green. Silas had registered it 4 years ago under the name of his former DOE supervisor, a retired man in Oregon who had agreed to hold the title as a personal favor and had asked no questions about why. Silas pulled the tarp free. They loaded into the Jeep. He drove south with his headlights off for the first 2 miles, navigating by memory on a road he had committed to his body rather than his mind. And when they reached the paved surface of the county road, he turned east and let the darkness of the mountain fall away behind them. "Tell me about Beckett's petition," Silas said. His voice in the confined space of the Jeep was still rough, still carrying the residue of 5 months of near silence, but the quality of focus in it was unchanged from everything Wren remembered. She walked him through it, the emergency filing the protective order, the hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. in Harrisonburg. Beckett's strategy established her standing as sole legitimate heir, challenged the fraudulent will through the elder abuse and undue influence framework, and used the documented evidence in the filing cabinet to shift the legal proceeding from a civil inheritance dispute into the context of an active federal investigation. Silas listened without interrupting. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and the particular quality of stillness he brought to any situation that required him to take in large amounts of information quickly and assess it accurately. "The raw data drive," he said when she finished. "In the pack." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "Sloan Merritt. You mentioned her in the letter." "I've been in contact with her through the satellite phone in the hatch," Silas said. Intermittently, carefully. She has been holding a complete copy of the digital evidence package for 14 months. Everything from the filing cabinet, plus 3 years of field measurement data, I transmitted to her in encrypted segments. She has been waiting for a signal to publish. Wren looked at him. "You already have a journalist holding the story." "The documentation was always going to need a public channel," he said. "Legal proceedings can be delayed, suppressed, appealed, and obstructed for years. Publication cannot be unpublished. Once Sloan runs the piece in the Post, the story exists in the world permanently, and any legal proceeding against Apex Continental happens inside that context rather than outside it." He paused. "I was waiting until the legal protection was in place before I gave her the signal. I did not want to expose her to the liability of publishing without the evidentiary framework to support her." "When do you give her the signal?" Silas glanced at her. "When the hearing is over and the protective order is either confirmed or replaced by something more permanent." He paused again. Unless the situation changes and we need to move faster. They drove in silence for a few miles. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten at its lowest edge, the first faint suggestion of dawn. Not yet color, just a slight modulation in the darkness. The mountains on either side were black shapes against a dark gray sky. Dad, Wren said. Yes. Taft. When he wakes up, he is not going to call the police, Silas said. He is an ex-law enforcement contractor working without a license on behalf of a corporate client conducting what amounts to criminal harassment of an 18-year-old. He will call Prescott Hale, and Hale will tell him to go home and say nothing because the last thing any of them want at this moment is Taft's activities documented in a police report. He paused, which is not to say they won't find other ways to apply pressure before 9 this morning. He was right about that. He was right about it before they had even reached the interstate. Wren's phone, the burner she had bought 2 days ago, buzzed once. She looked at the screen. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words. Tell Beckett to withdraw the petition. She showed it to Silas. He looked at it for 1 second and looked back at the road. Don't respond, he said. The phone buzzed again. This time the message was longer. The hearing will be reassigned. The protective order will be lifted. You will lose access to the property and everything in it. There is still an arrangement available. Call this number before 8 a.m. Wren set the phone face down on her knee. She looked out the window at the dark landscape moving past and thought about everything she had found in the past 3 days, the letter in the truck, the hatch in the mountain, the files, the email chain, the toxicology reports. Her father standing in the room he had built and then hidden himself inside, and she thought about the nature of the offer in that text. An arrangement. The kind of language that corporations used when they wanted you to understand that they were willing to make the evidence disappear and the question go away if you were willing to let it. No, she said. It was not directed at anyone in particular. It was simply the answer to a question that had briefly presented itself and had now been settled permanently. Silas said nothing. But the line of his jaw shifted slightly, the expression she had seen on his face her entire life, when she had done something or said something that confirmed a thing he already believed about her. They reached Charlotte at 6:40 in the morning. Beckett's office light was on. They went up the stairs and through the frosted glass door, and Beckett looked up from his desk and saw Silas Calloway standing in the doorway and went absolutely still. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Beckett stood up slowly from behind his desk. Slowly, the way a man stands when his body is responding to something his mind has not yet fully processed. And he crossed the room and put both hands on Silas's shoulders and looked at him with an expression that contained several years of complicated things. You stubborn son of a gun, Beckett said. I needed time, Silas said. You needed time, Beckett repeated. He released him and stepped back and shook his head. Once, the way a man does when he has decided to set aside the full emotional weight of a thing and concentrate on what is immediately in front of him. All right, we have 2 hours and 15 minutes. Sit down, both of you. They sat. Beckett poured 3 cups of coffee from a pot that had been sitting on a burner since before dawn and distributed them without ceremony. Then he spread the hearing documents across the desk and walked them through the structure of what was about to happen. The strategy had 3 components working simultaneously. The legal filing that morning would establish Wren as Silas's legitimate heir and challenge the fraudulent will on grounds of undue influence and elder abuse. Gretchen had married Silas under documented false pretenses, which invalidated her standing as a beneficiary under Virginia estate law. The evidentiary package from the filing cabinet would be submitted to the court as protected materials in an active federal investigation, which would transfer jurisdiction from the civil probate court, where Gretchen and Hale had been operating, to the federal bench, where Apex's local judicial relationships were far less reliable. And Beckett had, at 5 that morning, sent a formal cooperation request to the FBI's Richmond field office attached to a 40-page summary of the Apex Continental evidence. A request that, if accepted, would place the entire matter under federal investigative protection before the hearing even began. The weak point, Beckett said, is Hale. If he files a counter motion before 9 and finds a sympathetic ear in the civil court system, they can create enough procedural noise to delay the federal transfer. We need Hale neutralized before the hearing starts. Silas set down his coffee cup. I'll call him. Beckett looked at him. You'll call him. Hale has known me for 11 years, Silas said. He drafted my first will when Wren was 7 years old. He is not a true believer in any of this. He is a man who made a series of increasingly compromised decisions because the fees were significant and he told himself the risk was low. Now, the risk is no longer low, and he knows it. Silas looked at Beckett steadily. He needs someone to show him the door. I am going to show him the door. Beckett considered this for a long moment, then he pushed the desk phone across the desk. Silas dialed from memory. The call was answered on the third ring. There was a long silence on the other end, the particular silence of a man who has just seen a caller ID that his entire understanding of the world told him was impossible. Prescott, Silas said. I know what you're about to say. Don't say it. Listen. What followed was 8 minutes of conversation that Wren listened to from across the desk with the focused attention she had been applying to everything in the past 3 days. Her father's voice was calm throughout, not threatening, not pleading, but carrying the particular weight of a man who has complete information and is offering to share it in a controlled manner before circumstances force a less controlled distribution. He told Hale what the evidentiary package contained. He told Hale what the FBI cooperation request contained. He told Hale what Apex Continental's legal team was already doing, and what they would continue to do, and at what point in that process Prescott Hale's name would become permanently associated with the outcome. Then, he told Hale what cooperation with the federal investigation would look like in practical terms for a man in his position. The silence at the end of this was different from the silence at the beginning of the call. I need 2 hours, Hale said finally. You have 1, Silas said. The hearing is at 9. He hung up. He looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He'll cooperate, Silas said. You're sure? He's been a coward in one direction for 3 years, Silas said. It doesn't take much to make a coward go the other way. You just have to show him that the direction he's been running toward is more dangerous than the direction he's been running from. At 8:17 that morning, Prescott Hale called the lead attorney for Apex Continental's legal response team and informed him that he was withdrawing from the matter entirely and would be voluntarily presenting himself to the FBI Richmond field office at noon with full documentation of his 6-year involvement in the case. At 8:40, the FBI Richmond field office formally accepted Beckett's cooperation request and assigned 2 senior agents to attend the 9 a.m. hearing as federal observers, a designation that, in practical terms, meant that any judicial irregularity in the proceeding would be immediately documented and referred for investigation. At 8:58, Wren Calloway walked into the federal courthouse in Harrisonburg, Virginia, with her father beside her and Harlan Beckett 3 steps ahead, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 6 years of evidence, a hard drive of raw field data, and a cooperation agreement signed by a man who had spent 3 years helping the wrong side and had finally understood the cost of that decision. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Judge Patricia Ellsworth was a precise woman in her early 60s who listened to both sides with the expression of someone who has been on the bench long enough to be neither surprised nor impressed by anything, and who reserves her full attention for the quality of the evidence rather than the quality of the performance. She asked specific questions. She reviewed documents at the bench with the focused attention of someone who had done her own research before arriving. When Apex Continental's attorney, a polished man named Carver, who had flown in from Washington the previous evening, attempted to introduce the corporate asset claim, she interrupted him at the third sentence and asked him to explain, in precise terms, the legal basis for classifying an independent researcher's personal documentation as corporate property under a non-disclosure agreement that predated the research by 9 years. Carver explained for 4 minutes. The judge listened. Then she said, "Counsel, I have read the NDA in question. It covers proprietary data collected in the course of employment with the Department of Energy. Dr. Calloway has not been employed by the Department of Energy for 11 years. Your theory requires me to accept that a non-disclosure agreement follows a man through a decade of independent practice and retroactively claims ownership of research he conducted on his own time with his own resources on property he personally owns. I am not going to accept that." Carver tried twice more. Both times the judge declined to be redirected. At 11:40 a.m., Judge Ellsworth issued her ruling. The will of Silas Calloway was suspended pending a full evidentiary hearing on the grounds of fraud, undue influence, and material misrepresentation by the surviving spouse. Parcel 12F and all contents therein were designated protected materials in an active federal investigation and placed under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Western District Federal Court. Wren Calloway was recognized as the provisional administrator of her father's estate pending the full hearing. And Silas Calloway, who had been declared dead by a county medical examiner, whose documented financial relationship with Apex Continental had been submitted to the court. As part of the evidentiary package, was formally recognized as a living person with full legal standing, pending a brief administrative process to reverse the death certificate that the court indicated would be resolved within 72 hours. Gretchen Calloway was arrested at the house on Birchwood Lane at 12:06 p.m. She had been home. Wren learned this detail later from Beckett, who had been briefed by the federal agents who executed the warrant. Gretchen had been in the kitchen when the agents arrived, dressed composed, holding a cup of coffee, exactly as she had been holding one the morning she changed the locks. The composure lasted until the agents read the charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, wire fraud, in connection with the corporate scheme, and the charge that came from Hale's morning cooperation session, and from the toxicology documentation in the filing cabinet: conspiracy to commit aggravated assault through the deliberate contamination of a residential water supply. The composure broke on that last one, not into tears, into something colder and more controlled than tears, but broken nonetheless, a crack in the surface through which the thing underneath was briefly visible. The agents noted in their report that she did not ask for a lawyer until she was in the vehicle. She spent the first 6 minutes in complete silence looking out the window of the federal SUV at the house she had occupied for 6 years, and the manicured lawn she would not see again from that angle. Taft was picked up the same afternoon on a Forest Service road 2 miles from Parcel 12F, walking out on foot with a bruised jaw and no phone, and the expression of a man who has made a thorough assessment of his available options and found all of them unsatisfactory. He was arrested on charges of criminal trespass, unlicensed private investigation activity, and criminal threatening. He cooperated within 40 minutes of arriving at the county jail, primarily because Beckett had already anticipated his cooperation and had a proffer agreement waiting for him. Prescott Hale walked into the FBI Richmond field office at 12:04 p.m. with two banker's boxes of documents, a hard drive, and an attorney he had called from Beckett's office. His cooperation session lasted 7 hours. The material he provided 6 years of communications between himself, Gretchen, and Apex Continental's legal and regulatory affairs divisions filled the gaps in the documentary record that Silas's field research had left open. It established with the kind of specificity that removes all ambiguity from a federal prosecution the complete chain of command and decision-making behind the aquifer contamination, the cover-up, and the operation against Silas Calloway. It was enough for the U.S. Attorney's Office to open a formal grand jury investigation into Apex Continental before the business day ended. At 6:15 that evening, Silas called Sloan Merritt. Wren was sitting across from him in a booth at a diner off the highway outside Harrisonburg, the first real meal either of them had eaten in the past 24 hours. She watched her father's face while he talked to the journalist, and she watched the expression on it change as the conversation moved from the logistical to the personal. Sloan Merritt had been holding this story for 14 months. She had never published it, even though publication would have made her career, because Silas had asked her to wait, and she had believed in what he was doing. Wren could hear in the quality of her father's voice what it cost him to have asked that of someone, and what it meant to him that they had trusted him. "It's time," he said. "Everything is in place. Run it." The Washington Post piece published at 11 p.m. that night under Sloan Merritt's byline. The headline read, "1,000 people sick, 23 dead. How Apex Continental poisoned 4 counties and paid to keep it quiet." By 6 the following morning, it had been read 4 million times. By noon, 3 congressional offices had issued statements calling for immediate committee hearings. The EPA announced a formal investigation. 2 other journalists who had been independently working adjacent angles of the story, one in West Virginia, one in Kentucky, contacted Sloan Merritt to combine their documentation with hers, broadening the scope of the published record within hours of the initial piece. Apex Continental's stock lost 31% of its value before trading was suspended. The CEO, a man named Warren Pruitt, who had been with the company for 22 years, and whose name appeared in the documents as the primary signatory on the internal directives authorizing the illegal disposal operations, resigned by press release at 2 in the afternoon. The resignation did not prevent the federal agents who arrived at his home in suburban Richmond at 4 p.m. from serving him with a grand jury subpoena. Wren watched most of this from the living room of a hotel suite in Harrisonburg that Beckett had booked for the night, the first clean room with actual beds that she and her father had been in since the sequence of the last 3 days had begun. She sat on the couch with her laptop open and followed the cascade of events with the focused attention of someone who has set a thing in motion and is watching it move through the world, and she felt something she could not immediately name, not triumph exactly, not relief, though relief was in it. Something larger and more complex than either of those. The feeling of a weight that has been distributed across too few people for too long, suddenly shared, suddenly visible to everyone, suddenly carrying itself. Her father sat in the armchair by the window with a glass of water and the expression of a man taking inventory of everything that has changed and everything that has not. He was clean-shaved now for the first time in 5 months, and the beard was gone, but the hollows under his eyes remained, and he looked simultaneously younger and older than she remembered younger, because the sustained tension of the years of isolated work had loosened, and older because that tension had left its mark anyway. At 9 p.m., Beckett called. The grand jury was formally convened this evening, he said. The U.S. Attorney is treating this as a priority. You should expect subpoenas for both of you within a week to provide testimony. This is routine, and I will be with you for all of it. He paused. There is also the matter of the estate. Tell me, Wren said. The civil proceedings will take several months to complete fully, Beckett said. But Judge Ellsworth indicated off the record today that the fraudulent will is not going to survive the evidentiary hearing. The documented proof that Gretchen Calloway entered the marriage under false pretenses. Operating as a corporate agent removes her standing as a legitimate spouse under Virginia law. When the will is invalidated, Wren, you are the sole heir. He paused again. There is also the matter that Silas needs to explain to you himself. I know he hasn't yet. She looked at her father across the room. He had been listening to her end of the conversation. He nodded once. Thank you, Harlan, she said, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Beckett said. We have months of federal proceedings ahead of us. But yes, you're welcome. She set down the phone and looked at her father. The land, she said. Silas set down his water glass. He laced his fingers together in his lap, the gesture he made when he was about to explain something technical and wanted to make sure he was being precise. When I understood what Apex was doing to the aquifer system, he said, I understood that the legal and regulatory process alone would not be sufficient protection. Regulations can be amended. Permits can be reissued. A corporation with sufficient resources and political relationships can over time erode virtually any regulatory protection if the underlying resource is not structurally removed from their reach. He paused. The only way to permanently protect a water-bearing geological formation is to own the land above it. If the surface rights are held by a party that cannot be acquired, pressured, or legally maneuvered, the resource underneath is protected regardless of what any future administration decides about drilling permits or disposal regulations. Wren looked at him steadily. She could see where this was going. 4 years ago, Silas said, I began acquiring the land parcels surrounding Parcel 12F through a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. Each acquisition was small enough not to attract attention. Rural land in that part of Shenandoah County is not a high-profile market. I completed the last acquisition 14 months ago. He unclasped his hands. The combined holding is 240 acres. It sits directly above the primary recharge zone for the aquifer system that Apex has been contaminating. If that land is held as a protected natural conservation easement, the aquifer beneath it is legally insulated from any future drilling activity in perpetuity. Wren let the dimensions of this settle. What is it worth? She said. The land itself, as raw acreage, is approximately $12 million, Silas said. The conservation easement value, the legal and environmental protection it provides to the water system that supplies drinking water to 4 counties is assessed at somewhere between $55 and $70 million, depending on the methodology used. He paused. It is held in trust. The trust transfers to you as my sole heir when the estate is settled. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Harrisonburg was going about the business of an ordinary Wednesday evening, entirely unaware of the conversation taking place on the 3rd floor of the hotel on the east side of the highway. Wren thought about the morning she had stood on the porch at Birchwood Lane with 2 garbage bags and a broken zipped duffel and $500 and a piece of paper describing 5 acres of worthless cliff face. She thought about the Cracker Barrel parking lot and the letter and the drive north in the pre-dawn dark. She thought about the fissure in the rock and the steel door and the cold room inside the mountain where her father had packed 6 years of his life into a filing cabinet. She thought about 847 people in 4 counties who were sick in ways they did not yet have full explanations for, and 23 people who had died, and all the county health meetings and regulatory reports, and carefully managed statistical variants that have been used to keep those numbers from adding up to the truth. It's not about the money, she said. No, Silas said. It never was. It's about making sure they can't do it again. To anyone, ever, on this aquifer system. He paused, and the Washington Post piece is already being picked up nationally. Other aquifer systems, other companies using the same disposal methodology, other communities that have been told their water is safe and have had no reason to disbelieve it. He looked at her. What your grandfather used to say about geology, about pressure. The deepest pressure creates the hardest stones, Wren said. Silas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Outside the window, the last light of the day was fading over the Virginia mountains, the old mountains ancient and patient and indifferent to the particular human dramas that played out on their slopes. The same mountains her father had spent 30 years reading, measuring, mapping, understanding, in the way that a person understands something they have given their full life to. I built the hatch to protect you, he said. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it, by keeping you away from the people who wanted me gone. He paused. I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong, Wren said. You were working with what you knew at the time. What I didn't account for, he said, was that I had spent 18 years teaching you exactly how to walk into a mountain and find what you were looking for. Wren's phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She glanced at the screen. Sloan Merritt. She answered. 22 million readers in the first 12 hours, Sloan said without preamble. Her voice carried the particular pitch of someone managing a very large amount of adrenaline with professional discipline. 3 network affiliates have requested interviews. The Senate Environment Committee has scheduled an emergency session for next week. And I have a source in Apex's legal department who contacted me 2 hours ago with documentation of additional disposal sites in Montana. She paused. Wren, they've been doing this in Montana too. Different aquifer system, same methodology, same internal authorization structure. Wren looked at her father across the room. He was watching her, reading her expression with the patient attention he had always given to things that mattered. She held the phone between them so he could hear. How long has the Montana operation been running? She asked. At least 4 years, Sloan said. Possibly more. My source has internal communications, but not field data. Not the kind of documentation your father built for Virginia. A pause. I need someone who knows how to read an aquifer system. The room was quiet for a moment. Wren looked at her father. He looked back at her with the expression she had been seeing on his face her entire life. The expression that preceded every trip into the mountains, every survey, every careful and painstaking effort to understand what was happening underneath the surface of things that looked ordinary from the outside. He reached forward and picked up his water glass from the table. He looked at the water in it for a moment. Then he set it back down and looked at Wren. She put the phone back to her ear. We'll be in touch, she said.